Hello everyone, this is the Good Captain, and welcome to the scouting tutorial for Avalon Hills, Midway, and Guadalcanal. It's really important to have a very clear understanding of the rules around scouting. It's a very simple um, game mechanic, really, but there are a few nuances when using the whole entire rule set, and so I decided, because it's so important, let's just make its own tutorial. So let's just lay this up real quick. We're going to run this tutorial from the Allied side, and we're just going to use Port Moresby, Gilly Gilly, and Task Force 11. The Allied side will be Side A throughout throughout the duration of this tutorial, so we'll be doing everything first. In fact, the Japanese are going to be a completely passive enemy. I have set up some naval units out in the ocean for us to find, but we're just going to be doing the scouting portion of the air movement and search step, or at least that'll be the focus. So I really made this as simple as I could. We're only going to be moving 3 scout air units in this portion of the tutorial. 1 from Gilly Gilly, we've got 1 ready to go at Port Moresby, and we've got 1 ready to go at Task Force 11, which is composed of the ships Saratoga and the cruiser Atlanta, carrier Saratoga, cruiser Atlanta, and we have Scout O that's on board Saratoga ready to go. So in the assembly step, we're going to say that all 3 of these scouts are going to move from the ready box into the normal strike box of their respective units. So we'll launch Task Force 11's scout, we'll launch Gilly Gilly's scout, and we'll launch Port Moresby's scout. Okay, so that's done. We're going to skip over the ready step and the sea movement step of the action phase and just go straight to the air movement and search step. Now, technically, you can move your combat air units and you can move them first or last, or you can move scouts in between all of your combat air units, but you really want to get into the habit of leading off with your scout air units first, because they can expose the enemy to you and give you alternative targets, or perhaps higher priority targets to attack with the air raids that you've assembled. So scouting is, again, fairly simple. And we'll just start with this unit off of Gilly Gilly. The first thing you do is bring the scout air unit onto the search board, from the hex in which it originated from. So we're going to plop this CC scout down here on D7. And then we're going to move in whichever direction we feel like up to the limit of the range of the counter. So the range on this scout is 5, which means we can move 5 hexes, and we'll go ahead and move into D6. And when we move into D6, you're just going to literally call out to your opponent, or ask your opponent, or type to your opponent, however you're playing, and say, D6, is there anything in D6? And the Japanese player will say yes or no. We'll get into the details of what happens in a moment if there is something in D6, but there's nothing in D6. We check D5, there's nothing. Let's check C6, there's nothing there. So we got 2 more movements. Check C5, nothing, and we check B4, and there's nothing. Okay, so that's all 5. We've used all 5 of our movements, and that's it. The scout stays in hex B4 for the moment. You'll see why in a moment. So we'll move to our next scout. Let's try moving the Port Moresby scout. So we move him out onto the A6 hex, and we'll go ahead and move to hex B5. There's nothing there. C5, we know there's nothing there. D4, there's nothing there. Say E5, there's nothing there. So it can be a bit tedious, but once you get the hang of it, you and your opponent will breeze through this part. 1, 2, 3, 4. Heck, the 5th movement point, we check E4 and there's nothing. 6th, nothing. 7. And now our opponent says, there's something there. And now here are the options available to us as the scouting player. Well, actually, the first thing you want to do is mark the hex. Whether we get any information or not, we are going to put a marker here. So we'll put an enemy task force number 1 question mark. It means we don't have exact information on it, okay? And now we can determine the effectiveness of our scout. We can, in other words, find out how much information we can get from him. So in the rule book, it's Rule 15A 1.1, or if you click this tab at the top in the Vassal, sequence of play, at the top of the chart here, it has the search chart, and you can very quickly see what the search modifiers are. We get a +3. We're going to be rolling a d10. I should say the Allied player is going to roll a d10, and the Japanese player is going to roll a d10 and compare the results. But the Allied player will get a +3 for for making the search during a day turn. We're going to say that it's a day turn at the moment. And we're also going to get +2 per additional movement factor expended. So remember that when we moved into this hex, we spent our 7th point. So we still have 2 more movement points. This reflects the time spent by this search aircraft to get in close or maneuver into position to get a good look. We can tell it to move past and just report what it saw, and thereby reduce the chance of us getting an accurate contact report. And in this case, we would have the benefit of searching H3 and H2 or 2 other hexes of our choice, or we can have it spend 1 movement point, or we can have it spend its both remaining movement points. In this case, we're going to have it spend both remaining movement points, which will net us a +4 to add to our +3. So we're up to +7 on the Allied dice roll side. And the last is if there's any land at all in the hex, any islands or any shoreline, you get a +3. But if you're scanning or searching a base, an enemy base hex, you get a +6. So a quick look at the game board reveals that, yeah, this is an empty ocean hex. So we're just going to accept our +7 modifier. I rolled the dice and we roll a 7, if you can see that. So this, the Allied modified dice roll is a 14. The Japanese side will then roll. They roll a 3. Now, so we rolled greater than 3 times the amount of the Japanese player. So when we go back to the sequence of play, we see that when you roll 3 times as much or greater, the Japanese player must provide exact information of the surface ships, how many ships are there and what type they are, okay? So in this case, the Japanese player reports to us that they have 1 heavy cruiser in this task force. So we will now flip this counter over to its exact side. This is important because there's second and third order effects to having exact information, namely potential submarine attacks later. So you want to keep track of this as accurately as possible. So flip this over to its exact side, and then this scout air unit is now done moving, because remember, we spent its remaining 2 movement points circling this task force to get a better look. So what happens if you only roll 2 times as much or greater than your opponent? We know what happens when you roll 3 times as much. You get exact ship types and quantity, and exactly how many task forces is there is also revealed. But if you roll a tie or less, then obviously no information is earned from the search. But there's 2 other results. It's rolling twice as much, not 3 times as much, but twice as much. And if you just roll more than. So we'll start with twice as much. In a situation where you roll 2 times as much as your enemy, but not 3 times as much, your enemy has to give you the exact number of ships. That's it. They just have to tell you how many boats are in that task force. And remember that destroyer squadrons are individual ships, so they don't have to tell you how many ship units are there. They just have to tell you how many ships are in there, so they can count the individual destroyers as single ships. So here, I'll pull up this DD squadron. We'll drop it into Task Force 11. So this DD squadron 8 would be counted as 5 ships, right? So it's more interesting, and you still incur the benefits of having exact information on the search board for follow-on potential submarine attack in the following phase. But it wouldn't be helpful to determine, you wouldn't know if there's a carrier in that number of ships, right? And lastly, if you just roll greater than the number rolled by your opponent, the opponent has to tell you it has to give you a number that's at least half the number of ships, rounded up to double the amount of ships present. So they can basically lie they can give you a bogus number. So, and you don't get the effect, you don't get the exact benefits. You won't get follow-on submarine attacks or anything, any benefit from having exact information. In other words, we would flip this back over to its question mark side, even though we rolled greater than. Okay, so those are the effects of, or the results, the potential results from scouting. So we still have one more scout, and this one's coming out of Task Force 11 here in the Louisiade Archipelago in G8. So we'll get him out on the board, and we've kind of done our decent job searching to the north, so let's try searching to the east. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At least that's the projected path. I'm just going to take a quick pause here and state that when you are flying out of a task force with an aircraft carrier in it, it is a good tactic not to call out the first 2 or 3 or even 4 hexes of ocean that you first enter. Why? Because if you call out all 6, the enemy player might realize that, okay, there's a 6 I just saw something search these 6 hexes and it originated from hex H8. As far as I can tell, there could be an enemy task force adjacent to H8, right? So in this case, let's go 1, 2, 3, and then in hex number 4, in K8, we'll say to the Japanese player, is there anything in K8? Is there anything in L8? Is there anything in M8? We get negative, negative, negative. So this concludes the air movement and search step for this tutorial. Okay, and if there were any air raids going out or any other combats going on, they would then be resolved, and it would be the end of the. Now we're on to the air return phase. Except for I forgot one thing. Air units are not the only units that can actually search in the search phase here, or in this portion of a game turn. C units, task force markers essentially, and base units can also search after. So I'll just read this. This is rule 3D5. After moving all flying air units, so even designating your raids, I guess, C searches are conducted by calling out any desired hexes that contain one or more of the side's task force markers and or a base unit. So search information for these hexes from the opponent is handled exactly the same as what we just discussed. In other words, those modifiers are still the same. So here, I'll just play this out real quick. So after we do the air movement step, we could then call out, okay, A6, Port Moresby. The Japanese player would have to tell us if anything is there. This is important because there's many times in these different scenarios where you'll have transports that are trying to land troops and supplies and materials in base hexes to collect points, and it's always good practice to search your base hexes with your bases. Okay, so we'd call out A6, Port Moresby, D7, and Gilly Gilly, and we could have the option of doing the same thing with Task Force 11, hex G8, but we probably wouldn't want to, or because we would give away our position to the Japanese almost certainly. So what happens when combat air units move towards their objectives to attack them? Can you search on the way there? This is something you might be asking yourself. Well, just to recap, all flying combat air units originating from the same hex must be moved and kept together as far as their movement factors allow. If they can't reach the target hex that they're going to, they have to be left off in the last hex entered, and they cannot participate in that battle. So there's really a lot of restrictions on, the air raids. You got to be. So Port Moresby can really only attack one area per turn or one enemy per turn, and same with Gilly Gilly and Task Force 11 in this situation. What that translates to is something you might see something like this. So let's say we have 2 air groups that move out to attack that contact in F3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's what has to happen. And then let's say these guys hit lay. 1, 2. In terms of searching, what can you do? Well, this is what you can do. You can search along the track that both those air groups went, but you really, unless the entire air group stops to search a hex, the raid must continue to its designated area. In other words, you can search these hexes, but when you go to sequence of play, you would only have the +3 for searching during a day turn. You wouldn't be able to spend additional movement factors unless the entire group stopped unless the entire air group stopped to do that together. So again, they have to stay together. So this really discourages combat air units from actually doing searching, but you can still search along the tracks to the target, absolutely. Okay, we'll say that the air raids are all complete, whatever damage was done is done, and now it's the air return phase. The easiest one to do is this scout here. This scout would go straight back to Task Force 11 and go into the arming box, okay? It cannot search on its return track. That is not allowed. It's explicitly stated in the manual. So you just pull it off the board, put it back into Saratoga's arming box, and that's the end of it. These other two scouts are not so are not treated the same way, or at least they don't have they have the option of being treated the same way. But because there's asterisks next to both of these scout units' search number, it means they can actually remain flying for a turn. So to do so, all you'd have to do is right-click on the piece, or just flip it over if you're playing with the actual board, to the patrol side. Okay, and then the next turn, we'll do this for the both of them. Well, for the next turn, you could continue searching. So that just as long as you're within range of an American base or an Allied base that can receive the air unit, you could continue from where you are. So the next turn, we could use this search plane and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, and then it would be, it could land at Moresby or Gilly Gilly in that following turn's air return phase. Okay, the other thing, so that's one thing, that any scout with a asterisk next to its search number can just remain flying like that. So we'll do that for this one. Alternatively, if you're over an enemy fleet and you have this ability, you can shadow that unit and declare that, to the enemy, okay, this one's going to shadow. I'm going to have the scout that successfully scouted E3 shadow that task force, and then that declares to the opponent that on his next turn, when he moves this task force, let's say he moves it to G4, he has to announce that that's what's happening on his movement, and this scout will tag along and follow it. Okay. And actually, that is pretty much it. I thought this would be a little bit more elaborate, but I guess it's not. Again, scouting is fairly simple. But it's just important to understand what the units with asterisks can do, frankly, prior to getting into a game. Just another point of fact here, when you shadow, or when you order a unit to shadow, it really can't, in the following turn, it can't move. It's considered to take all the movement it can to track that fleet and report back to headquarters what that fleet is doing. However, you can use whatever hypothetical movement factors you had to gain better information. In other words, if you didn't have exact information on a fleet that you were shadowing, you'll very likely get it while you're shadowing. At any rate, I'm going to do a quick recap. This tutorial went over the basics of scouting. Well, not just the basics, really kind of went through all of the points about scouting. The main takeaways are, make sure you do scouting first before you assemble, or not before you assemble, but before you designate and launch your air raids against certain targets. Do your scouting first. Make sure that you are searching as thoroughly as possible to detect enemy fleets, and then make decisions about where you want your air raids to go. Units that have asterisks can stay out for a turn rather than coming back to base and rearming. That's very beneficial and important to understand, just because you basically lose a turn when you come back to base for rearming. Don't forget to search your bases after you've done all your searches and air movements. Search your bases. That's a good common practice to make sure that you're not being invaded by the enemy just to make sure that an enemy task force hasn't snuck in on you. Another good practice is, of course, if you're launching scouts from an aircraft carrier, it's good practice to just wait at least 2, usually 3, even sometimes 4 hexes before announcing actual hexes you wish to search. And we showed that by example. We didn't scout the first 4 hexes of the carrier scout that we sent out in this example. So that's pretty much it, except for one more rule I wanted to go over, and that is with regards to the search board here. Scout air units with that asterisk, because of their ability to remain flying, can actually take off and fly on turn 1 of any given whole day turn. In other words, the dawn flight, right? They can take off pre-dawn, and as long as they go to patrol on this turn 1 and come back on turn 2, then they can basically search at night or in the pre-dawn darkness. So again, you wouldn't have the benefit of searching during the day, of course. You wouldn't get that +3 modifier, but you could get a jump start on locating enemy fleets. That's a very important bit to understand as well. And the reference for that here is Rule 12, specifically 12E1. If this option is used, any scout air units with the ability to patrol may take off and fly during a night turn as long as they land during a day turn. For example, a scout could take off and fly during night turn 1, then patrol, and return to land during day 2, during turn 2, which is a day turn. Okay? Okay, so the next tutorial will be a sort of a culminating event in which we put together all the parts of all the examples and things we've gone over in the previous scenarios and sort of play out an actual turn or 2 of an operational scenario. So hope to see you then. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.